Welcome back, U.S. history. We are still talking the New Deal. Um, Speaking of which, that's right. That is the song Gone, Gone, Gone by the 1980s three piece Canadian electronic band, The New Deal. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. So, the first 100 days was the first 100 days, give or take, of Roosevelt's presidency, and he implements all these new programs, these new administrations, etc. We called it alphabet soup, the TVA, the WPA, all of that stuff. So, in the second 100 days, he issues the second New Deal. All we would still consider it all part of sort of the New Deal, but the second New Deal was first and foremost aimed at farmers. He added more money to the AAA, and that gave money to migrants, sharecroppers, and poor farmers. Migrants are basically workers that travel from location to location wherever the work is. So, all in all, he authorized more than $1 billion to help these tenant farmers eventually own their own land. Because as long as you're renting as a farmer, you're really not going to be making great profits because you'll still be paying off the rent on your place. This is a photo from Dorothea Lange. We talked about her, called Six Tenant Farmers Without Farms in Hardeman County, Texas. I love a self-explanatory photo title. If I had to guess, I would say those are six tenant farmers, none of whom have farms. Who are tenant farmers in Arkansas? The WPA. This one's near and dear to my heart because my great grandfather got a job with the WPA. It stands for Works Progress Administration. And the idea was to help urban workers to create as many jobs as they could, as quickly as they could. And these are not all urban workers, mind you. Some of these were country folk, but just as a broader mission statement, the goal was to help urban workers. So between 1935 and 1943, the WPA spent $11 billion to give jobs to 8 million workers. I don't know what the inflation is off the top of my head from 1943 to 2020, but 11 billion is a lot now. It was a ton back then. So Roosevelt's just continually dumping more and more money into the economy, into these programs that, at least in the short term, are doing a good job of resurrecting the U.S. economy. I think I skipped one. Did I? The WPA builds 150 airports, 651 miles of roads and streets, and 125,000 public buildings. That's significant for a couple of reasons. Number one, each of those jobs requires workers. Number two, each of those provides some sort of improvement to our nation's infrastructure, right? They're expanding roads and streets. They're building public buildings and airports. So these are all things that are good things to be happening anyway. Now you're putting those projects on, and you're putting people to work to accomplish them. Um, Here we have a photo, the Davis Street School Extension in Atlanta, under construction as part of the Works Progress Administration Program, November 2nd, 1936. All right. So, moving on. We get the NYA, the National Youth Administration. It was created to provide education, jobs, and recreation for young people, to get young people off the streets and into schools and jobs. That was their main priority. Remember, not too far or not too long before this, they were in the middle of the Industrial Revolution, and kids were also basically um, were more or less sweatshop workers. So this new emphasis on education was a big development. It was important. Here we go. Workers attending a class in auto mechanics organized by the National Youth Administration. Another thing, remember when Hoover was president, he was very anti union. He felt like unions undermined the free market and the ability of business owners to conduct business the way they wanted to conduct it. Roosevelt was the opposite of that. Unionism is typically associated with the left side of the political spectrum. And Roosevelt, in the interest of increasing worker rights and opportunities and empowering poor people, basically the working class, he passes the National Labor Relations Act. It ensured several things, but among them was collective bargaining. Collective bargaining is, I think of it like in sports terms. Every so many years, the NFL Players Union has to come to a collective bargaining agreement, where collective bargaining means the larger group gets to send representatives to negotiate or to lobby or bargain on their behalf. It allows workers to present a unified front. And unions have their critics as well. We finally get maximum hours at 44 hours a week, and minimum wage was set at 25 cents an hour. So, as much as teachers like to complain about our pay, it's much better than 25 cents an hour. So, let's look at this. October 1938, 25 cents to 97 is 5.15. The current minimum wage in the United States is still 5.15. So what is that? 23 years. Pretty bad. And it actually it varies state by state. It varies state by state. But this is the federal hourly minimum wage. So most states, it's going to be higher than that. The Social Security Act. That's one of the crowning achievements, a lot of people would say, for the New Deal and for Franklin Roosevelt as a president was getting the Social Security system created. Even if you have no idea what Social Security is, that's probably a term you've heard before. People are always talking about it on TV. There's always this fear that there won't be enough money when people retire. It's just it's a presence in the national political narrative. He's going to pass the act in 1935, and it comes initially with three main parts: a pension when you get to a certain age, unemployment compensation, and aid to families with dependent children and who are disabled, so welfare. In other words, Social Security Act is responsible for a lot of the social welfare programs that we've come to expect. The effects of the New Deal weren't strictly limited to businessmen or factory workers. It also affected women. That's Eleanor Roosevelt, former President Roosevelt's wife. She's a very well known and highly respected First Lady. She's going to do a lot of things during her time as First Lady, but one of her chief accomplishments was helping women get a bigger place on the stage in terms of national politics. She was also a trusted advisor to her husband. And thanks in part to First Lady Roosevelt's efforts and advocacy, we get Frances Perkins as the first female cabinet member. We actually just talked about her in government class. We're still in the 1930s, a solid 30 years, 25, 30 years away from what we would consider the civil rights era, sort of the proper civil rights era. But that's been a struggle that's been going on since the founding of America. And it's starting to pick up steam during the New Deal era. They even get the foundation of the nation's first all black union, called it the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. Like a train, a sleeping car was some kind of a train car with a bed in it, if I'm not mistaken. So that's significant. Before, it would have been illegal to organize in such a way. FDR is also going to do a lot in terms of appointing African Americans to political positions. There's a woman named Mary McLeod Bethune, who was the head of the Division of Negro Affairs of the NYA. So he did a lot to he gave opportunities to a lot of Black Americans, but he was not a champion of civil rights as we think of it now. I mean, he still very much had antiquated views on race relations and equality and that type of thing. Nonetheless, he helped Black people in America get a louder voice very slowly but surely. Even Native Americans benefit from the New Deal era policies. In 1924, they get full American citizenship. Think about that. These were people who were here before any of us. And it was in the 1920s that they were granted citizenship. We get the Reorganization Act in 1934 that gives Native Americans more ownership of their reservations. Um, in other words, policies moving away from assimilation towards autonomy. Assimilation is a term that means sort of abandoning your ways and adopting the ways of the country you're in or your new environment. So, like, in terms of trying to get Native Americans to assimilate, that lesson we did on Jim Thorpe, where they sent him to the Carlisle Indian Industrial School and they gave them all haircuts and gave them Christian names and that type of thing. So, and again, all these advancements, if I'm talking about African Americans, Native Americans, they're all very small, but they are happening, and the effects are positive. Oh, see, Oklahoma, a lot of reservations here throughout. Is that Arizona, New Mexico, Mississippi, or I guess that's Louisiana, excuse me, and a lot up here in the Dakotas. In 36, when that election rolls around, Roosevelt, and again, he had his critics. We talked about Huey Long, Father Coughlin. He had his critics, but just in terms of overall popularity, he was extremely popular, especially among views that had been disenfranchised. When I say disenfranchised, I mean kind of pushed away from the mainstream, sort of left out, or maybe treated as lesser than people like African Americans, Jewish people, Catholics, and other immigrants. Remember, Catholicism, it wasn't until JFK that we had a Catholic president. Catholicism was associated with foreigners, with Irish people, and Spaniards. So those were people who were looked down upon as well. But my point is just FDR really appealed to these marginalized groups. Again, not to turn it into a vocab lesson, but the margins, like of your paper, that's the side. So marginalized, again, think just kind of pushed to the side. That is about as thorough of a victory as you could get. Landon won in Vermont and Maine, but Roosevelt won everywhere else. So you can see he really rolled into the 1936 presidency with a ton of steam. I'm trying to look up the margins of the Landon Roosevelt. We'll figure that out, and I'll get back to you. How about that? I'm going to. Well, we'll talk for a minute, and then we'll start talking about radio and the effect of radio, and then once we get to that, I'm going to play you guys a clip of a fireside chat. But first, we gotta make it that far. So we talked when we were talking about the Roaring Twenties, about how mass media and television and movies and radio shows were having a huge impact on American society. And this was the first time that the nation had been this easy to reach and that they'd had the technology to present these products, whether it be a movie, a TV show, an advertisement, whatever. And it's not always going to be something related to business or to selling stuff. We're going to see that radio was used for political purposes as well. It was used very, very effectively by FDR. We have a new era. It was Clark Gable from Gone with the Wind, Marlene Dietrich, and James Cagney. One of the most iconic films from the 30s is Gone with the Wind. And maybe I shouldn't admit this as a lifelong Georgian and a history teacher, but I've never actually seen it. Maybe I'll do that since we're quarantined. Other notable movies: The Wizard of Oz, that one I have seen, and Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, also fantastic. Radio, the original entertainment. I still have an AM FM radio that I got when my grandmother passed away, and it's just amazing. I had a younger friend come and visit, and he asked, like, "What is that?" And I was like, "That's FM/AM radio." And he was like, "Well, yeah, but how does it work?" I don't know how the radio works, but it's spectacular, and it really helped to shift the social lives, for lack of a better word, or the entertainment desires of America during this era. So sales of radio increased from 13 million in 1930 to 28 million by 1940, more than doubled. By 1940, nearly 90% of American homes own a radio. Think about how some of us just plop down in front of the couch or in front of our phone, and we'll just spend hours. That was what they did back then, except it was with radios. I was trying to look up statistics on percentage now that have cellular telephones. I'll add that to the list of stuff I'll tell you tomorrow. Finally made it to the fireside chats. FDR was very savvy about taking advantage of this mass communication. With 90% of Americans having access to radios, he knew that he could reach just instantly 90% of his citizens. And he handles that by giving fireside chats. What that means, keep having technical difficulties, guys, but he used these fireside chats, as he called them. They were basically just chances for him to speak to the nation, to hopefully ease their minds, and to keep them in the loop on what was going on, because this was unprecedented. Roosevelt did a very good job of using the tools he had to communicate with his people. And I'm going to pull up audio of his very first fireside chat called The Banking Crisis. This is pretty long. It's 13 minutes. So I won't play the entire thing, but I'm going to post this video on our class page so you can take a look at it if you want to. Good job, guys. I will talk to you on Monday.
During Franklin D. Roosevelt's presidency, he delivered a number of radio broadcasts, which became known as fireside chats. President Roosevelt used these fireside chats to inform and build public support for his administration's efforts during the Great Depression, World War II, and the enactment of New Deal policies. Next, President Roosevelt's first fireside chat from March 12, 1933. This address was titled The Banking Crisis.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States. My friends, I want to talk for a few minutes with the people of the United States about banking. To talk with the comparatively few who understand the mechanics of banking, but more particularly with the overwhelming majority of you who use banks for the making of deposits and the drawing of checks. I want to tell you what has been done in the last few days and why it was done and what the next steps are going to be. I recognize that the many proclamations from state capitals and from Washington, the legislation, the Treasury regulations, and so forth, couched for the most part in banking and legal terms, ought to be explained for the benefit of the average citizen. I owe this in particular because of the fortitude and the good temper with which everybody has accepted the inconvenience and the hardships of the banking holiday. And I know that when you understand what we in Washington have been about, I shall continue to have your cooperation as fully as I have had your sympathy and your help during the past week. First of all, let me state the simple fact that when you deposit money in a bank, the bank does not put the money into a safe deposit vault. It invests your money in many different forms of credit, in bonds, in commercial paper, in mortgages, and in many other kinds of loans. In other words, the bank puts your money to work to keep the wheels of industry and of agriculture turning round. A comparatively small part of the money that you put into the bank is kept in currency, an amount which in normal times is wholly sufficient to cover the cash needs of the average citizen. In other words, the total amount of all the currency in the country is only a comparatively small proportion of the total deposits in all the banks of the country. What then happened during the last few days of February and the first few days of March? Because of undermined confidence on the part of the public, there was a general rush by a large portion of our population to turn bank deposits into currency or gold. A rush so great that the soundest banks couldn't get enough currency to meet the demand. The reason for this was that on the spur of the moment, it was of course impossible to sell perfectly sound assets of a bank and convert them into cash except at panic prices far below their real value. By the afternoon of March 3rd, a week ago last Friday, scarcely a bank in the country was open to do business. Proclamations closing them in whole or in part had been issued by the governors in almost all of the states. It was then that I issued the proclamation providing for the national bank holiday. And this was the first step in the government's reconstruction of our financial and economic fabric. The second step, last Thursday, was the legislation promptly and patriotically passed by the Congress, confirming my proclamation and broadening my powers so that it became possible, in view of the requirement of time, to extend the holiday and lift the ban of that holiday gradually in the days to come. This law also gave authority to develop a program of rehabilitation of our banking facilities. And I want to tell our citizens in every part of the nation that the National Congress...
I think he does a really good job of breaking it down into plain English. As he said, when you put your money in a bank, the bank doesn't just put it in a box, they invest it. So I thought he did a great job of explaining it to the everyday American who probably had no idea what the heck was going on or where their money went. So just a way that he was very savvy and really did an excellent job of trying to maintain some semblance of peace and normalcy during just a bizarre and difficult time.